Have you ever had a morning when the world just shifted under your feet? When you woke up with your whole future mapped out, only to find that everything you counted on had quietly vanished? My name is Rachel Kim, and if you've ever chased a dream so hard you could taste it, I hope my story finds a place in your heart today. I wasn't always someone who took risks, but this past year I'd been brave in ways I never expected, packing up my life in California for a new adventure in London, with nothing but hope and a promise in my pocket. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to creep across my apartment floor as I poured my morning coffee and opened my banking app more out of habit than necessity. But what I saw next made me drop my mug, splattering coffee across the kitchen tiles. The relocation fund $300,000 had disappeared. Not a penny left. My chest tightened. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake. A glitch. I refreshed the app, checked the transaction history, called the bank, voice trembling. Each answer I received only confirmed my growing fear. The money was gone, transferred out in the early hours, with no way to reverse it. My mind raced. Did I miss an alert? Was there a breach? A hacker? But the reality was far more personal and far more devastating. The phone rang, and I saw the caller ID, Lucille Harrington, my mother-in-law. My stomach twisted, a feeling all too familiar for anyone who's ever had their trust broken by family. "Rachel, dear Lucille," purred her tone, sweet as spun sugar. "I thought you'd notice the account was a little lighter this morning. I've made an executive family decision. Sylvia really needs that beach house, after everything she's been through." I stood there numb, the phone pressed to my ear. Her words washed over me like ice water, rationalizing, justifying, taking what wasn't hers to give. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand why my dreams were worth less than her daughter's comfort. But all I could manage was a whisper, that money was for my move, for my job, for our future. Lucille's answer was sharp, dismissive. "Darling, you only got that promotion because of your fancy resume. Sylvia needs a fresh start. I have access through Andrew's accounts, and what's his is mine to manage." In that moment, everything felt heavy, the weight of 12 years spent trying to belong, the quiet sacrifices, the times I'd bitten my tongue to keep peace. Now I was watching my future being signed away with a single stroke of a pen I never held. Some part of me wanted to beg her to give it back, to reason with her, but something inside me finally broke through the fear. I realized this wasn't just about money or a job or even London. It was about the story so many of us live when family love is conditional and loyalty is measured by what we're willing to surrender. I hung up the phone. The room was silent except for the distant hum of city traffic and the pounding of my heart. I stared at the empty account, the boxes I'd packed for my new life, suddenly feeling heavier than before. But beneath the grief and shock, something began to simmer, a quiet determination. If you've ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or be grateful for scraps, you know that feeling. That's the place where real change starts, not with anger, but with the courage to say enough. Before I share what happened next, let me ask you, have you ever lost something that felt like your whole future? If so, I want you to stay with me. Because sometimes when the ground disappears beneath your feet, you learn just how strong you really are. When people talk about family, they often picture Sunday dinners, warm hugs, and unconditional support. But what happens when love is tangled up with power and support comes with invisible strings. For me, family always felt a bit like a club with secret rules. Ones I never quite learned, no matter how hard I tried. Lucille, my mother-in-law, was the president of that club. From the first day I married Andrew, she made it clear that in the Harrington family, there was only one way to do things, her way. It wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was the smallest things that let me know where I stood. Like the year Lucille reorganized our wedding gifts and decided which ones Andrew and I could keep, sending the rest to Sylvia, who needed them more. Or the countless times she'd invite herself to our home, quietly rearranging furniture or peeking at our bills on the counter, making comments about responsible budgeting as if I were a teenager, not an adult woman with a career. Each incident was so subtle that if I protested, I sounded petty. Yet together, they built a quiet wall between who I was and who I was allowed to be. It's a story I know many women have lived, especially in families where tradition is both a blessing and a weapon. I remember once confiding in a friend whose eyes widened in sympathy. She'd grown up in the same kind of world where mother-in-laws kept a ledger of every favor, every loan, every sacrifice made for the good of the family. She told me about her own battles, the times she'd given up dreams or changed plans just to keep the peace. "You're not alone," she said, squeezing my hand. "But you have to draw your own lines, or they'll always move them for you." Lucille, of course, always justified her choices as putting family first. She was generous in public, hosting charity luncheons, donating to church drives. But at home, her generosity often came with an agenda. If Sylvia needed a down payment, Lucille would raid Andrew's savings, then announce it over dinner like it was a family win. If I questioned her, I was ungrateful or didn't understand the Harrington way. Over time, I learned that family to Lucille meant loyalty to her will above all else. I wish I could say Andrew always saw what was happening, but more often than not, he tried to stay neutral. That's just how Mom is. He'd shrug, caught between wanting to keep the peace and not wanting to choose sides. I understand now that many partners are trapped in this middle ground, wanting to be fair, but not realizing that silence often sides with the status quo. It's a lonely place to be loving someone who can't always protect you, not because they don't care, but because family patterns run deep. Looking back, I realized the real danger wasn't the money or even the manipulation. It was how slowly I'd accepted the idea that my needs, my dreams were always second to someone else's. I see now that giving up a little ground one battle at a time left me standing alone at the edge of my own life. The lesson I wish I'd learned sooner is this: boundaries aren't about shutting people out. They're about keeping your own soul intact. That morning, staring at my empty bank account, all those years of small concessions suddenly made sense. Lucille's betrayal wasn't a single act. It was the result of 1,000 tiny invasions, each one chipping away at my confidence. I knew then that something had to change, not just for me, but for every woman who's ever been told to be the bigger person, while her dreams are quietly taken apart. As the day wore on and Lucille's words echoed in my ears, a new determination took root. I wasn't just fighting for my lost relocation fund. I was standing up for my right to have a voice to choose my own future. And as you'll see sometimes, the greatest gift a family can give you is the strength to break free from their old stories and begin writing your own. People always talk about the importance of family, but what's less discussed is how quietly family can make you doubt yourself. When you live for years in the shadow of someone else's rules, you start to question if your needs are really needs at all, or just selfish wishes you should hide away. For me, it wasn't just Lucille's actions that left a mark. It was the silence of everyone else, the way Andrew would look away, how Sylvia would roll her eyes, the cousins who shrugged, as if all of this was normal. That silence grew louder over the years, until I felt like a ghost in my own home. One of the hardest moments came just before our 3rd anniversary. I'd worked overtime for weeks to surprise Andrew with a weekend getaway, something just for us. The day before we were set to leave, Lucille needed help moving a few things at her house. Andrew, caught in that tug-of-war, told me, "You know, Mom can't do this alone." By the time he came home, the spark was gone from our plans. I remember sitting on our couch feeling childish for being disappointed, wondering if I was making too much of it. It's not a big deal, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it was another moment where my happiness was quietly made less important. Looking back, I realize that's what gaslighting looks like. Not always loud arguments or obvious cruelty, but small seeds of doubt planted until you question your own perspective. I remember once mentioning to a friend that Lucille had rearranged our furniture again for better feng shui, and she laughed, assuming I was exaggerating. I wondered, maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe this was just how family worked. That's the real power of subtle manipulation. It makes you complicit in your own silencing. I've since learned that this isn't just my story. So many women and men find themselves bending over backwards to keep peace in families that are supposed to feel safe. I've heard stories from friends and even strangers who felt invisible at their own dinner tables, who apologized for needs that were never outrageous to begin with. In the U.S., entire support groups exist for people navigating toxic family patterns. Yet so many of us suffer alone, thinking we're the problem for wanting to be heard. It took me a long time to understand the lesson: love should never make you disappear. Real family, real partnership means both people matter, both voices count. Whenever we accept less, when we swallow our truth for the sake of harmony, we lose a piece of ourselves. And the more pieces you give away, the harder it is to remember what you look like whole. That morning after Lucille's call, those memories rushed back. The quiet years of going along to get along, of believing that sacrifice was my duty, not a choice. Suddenly I realized just how isolated I'd become. How easy it was for Lucille to take what was mine, because she'd already trained me to believe I didn't really deserve to keep it. If you've ever felt that way, please know you're not alone, and it's not too late to find your own voice again. What happened next was the moment everything began to change. For the first time, I stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. Instead, I started looking at what I could do, how I could reclaim not just my lost money, but my sense of self. Because when you're ready to stand up for your own worth, even the smallest step can break the silence that's held you captive for so long. When I look back on that day, I realized something quietly remarkable. Even while I was being made to feel small, I was building strength. It didn't happen with a single act of defiance. It grew over years quietly as I learned to take small steps to protect myself. I wish I could say it was all strategy, but most of the time it was born from necessity. If you've ever felt outnumbered in your own life, you'll understand sometimes protecting your boundaries means quietly building them brick by careful brick. Long before my relocation fund vanished, I'd experienced other little mysteries. Random charges appeared on joint accounts, birthday checks from my parents disappeared, or a tax refund was reallocated to help Sylvia during her divorce. Each time I'd bring it up only to be met with confusion or indignation from Andrew or Lucille. "Don't be so paranoid," they'd say, or "it's all for family." Over time, I started keeping a private spreadsheet recording every odd withdrawal and snapping photos of important receipts. It felt lonely sometimes, even sneaky, but I knew it was my way of holding on to my own story. It turned out I wasn't the only one. When I confided in a colleague at work, someone I trusted with more than just project updates, she told me her mother-in-law had borrowed her car for months and refused to return it. Another friend shared how her brother had drained their shared inheritance account because he needed it more. These stories, though unique in detail, were painfully familiar in theme. In the U.S., financial abuse inside families is more common than many admit, often hidden under the guise of love, tradition, or doing what's best for everyone. What I learned through these shared confidences was simple: your intuition matters. If something feels wrong, even if everyone around you says it's fine, it's worth trusting that gut feeling. So I started reading up on financial safety. I learned about setting up dual authentication for important accounts, using alerts for large transactions, and keeping personal passwords private, even from those I loved. At first it felt cold, maybe even a little untrusting. But the more I did it, the more empowered I became. Protecting myself didn't mean I loved my family less. It meant I was finally loving myself enough to stay safe. That morning after I hung up on Lucille, I found myself oddly grateful for all those years of over-preparation. Because I worked in tech, I had insisted on extra security when my company sent the relocation fund. Every transaction over a certain amount required 2 signatures and triggered a notification to my email. I spent hours combing through my records, compiling every screenshot, every text, every odd withdrawal, building a case that was finally about more than money. It was about truth. I know not everyone has the same resources I do, but everyone has the right to protect what's theirs. My advice to anyone who senses trouble: don't wait until it's too late. Set up safeguards, keep your paperwork organized, and don't be afraid to ask questions, even if it ruffles a few feathers. The lesson is clear: you are not powerless, even when it feels like the world is stacked against you. As I sat there with a folder full of evidence, I felt something shift inside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible, I felt prepared. And with that new sense of resolve, I picked up the phone and called my company's security department. It was time to turn quiet strength into action. Little did I know the next steps would test me in ways I never imagined. But I was finally ready to fight for myself and for the life I deserved. The thing about working in a tech company is that you learn early on, every system is only as strong as its weakest link. It's a lesson drilled into us in every cybersecurity training, every team meeting. At work, we trust, but we also verify, double-checking, triple confirming, making sure nothing slips through the cracks. That culture, I realized, had seeped quietly into the way I handled my own life, even if I never meant it to. Now, with my relocation fund gone, I found myself grateful for all those extra steps I used to grumble about during onboarding. When I reached out to the corporate security team, I expected a slow, bureaucratic process. Instead, they responded with urgency and empathy, something I hadn't felt from my own family in years. I explained everything: the missing funds, the family dynamics, the history of boundary crossing. They asked for documentation, and for the first time, I had everything ready. I sent screenshots of transactions, emails confirming my dual authentication setup, even the phone log with Lucille's gloating confession. Within hours, the company flagged the suspicious transfer and began the official investigation process. One thing I learned quickly is that in the corporate world, the rules are clear. No amount of "but we're family" can override security protocol or legal compliance. My company's policies meant that any transfer above a certain amount triggered an automatic review. Thanks to this, the funds were traced before they reached the seller of the beach house. The corporate legal team worked with my bank to freeze the transaction, leaving Lucille's plans and Sylvia's dreams of a seaside escape suspended in digital limbo. In a world where families bend rules, the company's refusal to look the other way felt like a quiet miracle. Of course, the family response was swift and dramatic. My phone lit up with calls and messages, not just from Lucille and Sylvia, but from cousins, aunts, even family friends. I was accused of betrayal, of airing dirty laundry to outsiders. "Why didn't you just let it go?" they pleaded. But I couldn't not, when letting it go would mean sacrificing my future for someone else's entitlement. In those moments, I realized how often we're taught to keep the peace at any cost, even when that cost is our own well-being. I found myself thinking about all the stories I'd heard from colleagues, women and men whose families had borrowed retirement accounts, used their credit cards, or pressured them into co-signing loans. It's a silent epidemic masked by phrases like, "we're in this together," or "family helps family." But true help, I've come to believe, doesn't require secrecy or guilt. Real support builds you up. It doesn't drain you dry. What surprised me most was the shift inside myself. Each time I forwarded another piece of evidence, each time I stood my ground with the company or the bank, I felt the old fear recede just a little. I started to trust the systems I'd helped build, not just the digital ones, but my own internal boundaries. For the first time, I saw that protecting myself didn't have to mean shutting people out. It simply meant standing up for what was right. With the funds now frozen and the investigation underway, I braced for the next battle facing my family. The company had done its part, but I knew the hardest conversations were still to come. Would Andrew stand by me or retreat further into old patterns? Would anyone in the Harrington family see the truth behind the drama? As I prepared for the inevitable storm, I reminded myself of a lesson I wished I'd learned sooner. Systems, whether corporate or personal, only work when we insist on using them even when it's uncomfortable. And sometimes, holding your ground is the bravest thing you can do. When you challenge a family's unspoken rules, you learn quickly just how tightly they're woven. The days after the company froze, the funds were a blur of ringing phones, anxious text messages, and the unmistakable chill of being talked about behind closed doors. It felt like stepping onto a witness stand, where everyone else already knew the verdict. Lucille, usually so poised, called in tears, alternating between fury and heartbreak. "How could you do this to us, Rachel?" she demanded. "After everything I've done for you." Her words ached not just for their accusation, but for how familiar they sounded. How often love and guilt had been used in the same breath. Andrew, too, was caught in the crossfire. For years, he'd been the peacekeeper, smoothing things over whenever tensions rose. Now the cracks in that strategy began to show. He was distant, withdrawn, as if hoping silence would somehow keep us from falling apart. I watched him try to be everywhere at once, comforting his mother, reassuring me, making excuses to Sylvia. But the truth is, sometimes peacekeeping only keeps everyone stuck in the same painful cycle. Real harmony. I was starting to learn only happens when the truth is allowed into the room. The family tribunal wasn't a formal event, but it may as well have been. Relatives I barely saw at holidays now chimed in with advice and judgment. You could have worked this out privately. Family shouldn't get the law involved. Think of Sylvia, she's suffered so much already. Each message carried an undertone of disappointment, a quiet warning that I'd crossed a line you're not supposed to see, let alone step over. I began to understand how powerful collective silence could be, how it wraps around you, urging you to shrink just enough to fit back into place. I heard stories from others' friends who'd lost inheritances, savings, even homes, all because standing up for themselves was considered betrayal. In so many families, the desire to keep the peace is stronger than the desire for justice. A woman in my support group shared how she'd spent years paying off debts her brother racked up in her name, simply because he needed help. Another said she'd spent holidays pretending nothing was wrong, hoping that silence would eventually bring safety. But I realized that silence isn't safety, it's surrender. What surprised me most was how isolating this kind of fallout can be. Even when you know you're right, it's hard not to feel guilty when everyone around you acts as if you've broken the only rule that matters: don't upset the family. In those days, I started writing down my feelings, not as evidence for anyone else, but as a lifeline for myself. Each word reminded me why I'd drawn the line, why I needed to hold it, even if it meant being misunderstood. I began to see that courage isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, choosing not to answer another guilt-laden call, or refusing to let shame rewrite the truth. Each time I honored my own boundaries, I felt a little less alone, a little more certain that I was doing the right thing, not just for me, but for anyone who'd ever been told to settle for less. As the dust settled and the outrage slowly faded into uneasy silence, I realized that what came next would require more than just resolve. It would require proof, clarity, and the willingness to keep telling the truth even when the story was hard to hear. The stage was set for the real confrontation, and I was finally ready to let the facts speak for themselves. The day the truth finally came out wasn't the dramatic showdown I once feared. It was in a way quieter and more dignified than I expected. My company's investigation team contacted the bank and retrieved security footage Lucille at the teller window, signing forms with Andrew's name, confident in her authority. She never thought anyone would question her. Watching that video, I felt a mix of sadness and vindication. For years, I'd been told my instincts were wrong, that I was imagining the power plays and shifting boundaries. But there on a grainy security feed was the undeniable proof that it wasn't just in my head. The investigators presented everything to me: the forged signature, the transfer logs, even emails Lucille had sent to the real estate agent in the days leading up to the transfer. Each piece of evidence was another thread in a tapestry of entitlement woven tightly through years of unspoken family rules. I remembered every time I'd second-guessed myself, every apology I'd offered for simply asking questions. It was painful, but it was also freeing. The facts didn't care about family hierarchy or tradition, they just told the truth. Lucille's response was almost predictable. At first, she denied any wrongdoing, insisting that she had verbal permission from Andrew. But my company had requested Andrew's Antarctic expedition schedule. He'd been out of contact for weeks, unreachable except for emergencies. Presented with this, Lucille's confidence faltered. Her voice shook, and for the first time she seemed smaller, vulnerable, in a way I'd never seen. There was a lesson in that moment. Even those who seem the most powerful are rarely invincible when held up to the light of truth. Family dynamics can make even the most obvious facts feel blurry. I spoke with a colleague whose father had forged his signature to take out a loan. The pain wasn't just financial, it was the shattering of trust. She told me, "You never forget the first time you see a parent as just another person, flawed, frightened, and desperately trying to keep control." It helped me see Lucille not only as an adversary, but as a woman terrified of losing her place in a world that prizes image above all. As the investigation unfolded, The story spread through the Harrington family, each new detail stripping away the illusion of harmless family meddling. Cousins who once judged me for making trouble now sent quiet messages of support, or their own confessions of moments when Lucille's power had left them wounded. The lesson was clear: sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the whole story, even if it exposes uncomfortable truths. By the time Lucille sat across from me in the company's conference room, flanked by attorneys and her composure unraveling, I realized I no longer needed an apology. I'd spent years searching for validation, hoping for a change of heart that might never come. Now what mattered was the record, the facts that could not be denied, the boundaries drawn in black and white. In that moment, I was done negotiating with guilt. With the truth exposed, the process shifted from confrontation to consequences. The legal wheels began to turn, but as much as I wanted closure, I knew the aftermath would bring its own set of challenges for Lucille, for Andrew, for the family whose rules had always kept us trapped. What came next would not just be about justice, but about healing and the courage to step into a future where honesty mattered more than tradition. The weeks that followed felt like living in a house where every picture frame was slightly crooked, familiar, but unmistakably off. As the news spread, Lucille's carefully curated image began to unravel. Invitations to charity galas quietly dried up. Her book club met without her. Even the local church, once quick to celebrate her generosity, suddenly had less room at the table. I watched all this from a distance, surprised at how quickly reputations can shift when truth comes to light. It wasn't schadenfreude I felt, but a strange sorrow for someone who had spent so much energy keeping up appearances, only to find herself alone when she needed forgiveness most. The ripple effect didn't stop with Lucille. Sylvia, once so accustomed to her mother's backing, struggled to adjust. The dream of a beach house vanished in paperwork, and shame replaced by the hard work of standing on her own. She left brief, wounded voicemails torn between anger and embarrassment. Even Andrew wasn't immune to the fallout. Friends who'd once dropped by for cookouts now kept their distance. Our home felt quieter, emptier. The laughter replaced by long silences, and the realization that sometimes consequences touch every corner of a family, not just the guilty party. I received messages from people I hardly knew, cousins, neighbors, even a former teacher, each with their own story of a boundary crossed or a confidence broken in the name of family. It was as if the truth had given everyone permission to speak, to say, "This happened to me too." One woman wrote about her brother who had used her credit to buy a car she never drove. Another shared about an uncle who emptied a college fund for a family emergency that never really was. These stories connected us, a quiet reminder that wounds inflicted in secret fester the longest. Looking back, I learned that consequences are never as simple as we imagine. They can be sharp like the slam of a door or slow like the fading of a friendship. But they are necessary. When we fail to hold each other accountable, we invite more pain, more secrecy, more generations lost to the same patterns. I realized that real love doesn't mean looking away from hard truths. It means facing them so that everyone, yes, even those who hurt us, has a chance to change. During this time, I leaned into my support system. I started therapy, joined an online group for people navigating family betrayal, and spent time reconnecting with friends I'd let slip away during the years I'd spent trying to keep the peace at home. Healing, I discovered, doesn't happen all at once. It's found in the small everyday choices: choosing to answer a kind message instead of a cruel one, taking a walk instead of ruminating, allowing myself moments of hope in between waves of grief. As legal proceedings moved forward, I saw Andrew begin his own process of reckoning. He spoke less of blame and more of responsibility. I knew our relationship wouldn't be the same, but for the first time, I felt we were moving towards something honest, even if it was raw and uncertain. The lesson for all of us was that consequences, while painful, can be a starting point for real change, if we have the courage to let them in. And as the dust settled, I began to look past the wreckage, toward what healing might actually mean, not just for me, but for everyone who had lived too long under the weight of unspoken rules. The next step I knew would be learning how to rebuild and how to create boundaries that weren't meant to keep love out, but to let something better in. Healing, I've learned, rarely follows a straight line. In the early days after everything broke open, I half expected some wave of relief to wash away the ache. But what actually came was quieter. A slow settling, a cautious hope mixed with grief for the family I thought I could have if only I'd tried harder. I started therapy both for myself and eventually with Andrew. It was humbling to admit how long I'd ignored my own needs for the sake of peace, but each session helped me find pieces of my old self. The girl who used to believe she was worthy of kindness, not just resilience. I found comfort in reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during those years, when I'd isolated myself for the family's sake. My best friend Mara would send silly memes or surprise me with coffee, reminding me what safe love feels like. I joined a support group online where strangers, women and men, shared stories of betrayal and recovery. There's something healing in saying "me too," and hearing it echoed back. We traded advice about setting boundaries not out of anger, but out of respect for ourselves. Boundaries, I discovered, are acts of care, not punishment. In therapy, I practice simple scripts. I'm not comfortable discussing this, or that decision isn't up for debate. At first, the words stuck in my throat. Years of training had taught me that no was the beginning of a fight. But as I tried, I realized healthy boundaries make space for real relationships. They let you invite in only what helps you grow, and gently close the door on what doesn't. Mara would say, it's not about shutting people out. It's about letting yourself breathe. Andrew struggled too. He was used to keeping the peace by avoiding hard conversations. For a while, he seemed lost, unsure if he could be both a good son and a good husband. Therapy was hard for him, but slowly, he began to see that love rooted in fear or guilt isn't love that lasts. One afternoon after a particularly raw session, he told me, I want to learn how to show up, not just smooth things over. It was a turning point, proof that even old patterns can be reshaped with patience and honesty. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that healing doesn't mean everything is perfect. It means we honor the wounds, learn from them, and then choose a different path. Sometimes that means letting go of the fantasy of a picture-perfect family, or forgiving ourselves for staying silent when we wish we'd spoken up. It means celebrating each small act of self-respect, a boundary held in need, expressed, a truth finally spoken. As the seasons changed, I started to see glimpses of a future not built on old anxieties, but on trust and possibility. I began to dream again, not about the family I hoped to fix, but about the woman I could become. The pain didn't vanish, but it softened, making room for new beginnings. And as I looked ahead, I realized the most important boundary I could draw was this: I would never again apologize for protecting my own heart. What came next was a chance to start over, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever wondered if it's possible to build a new kind of family, one where love is chosen, not demanded. If you'd told me a year ago that standing up for myself would mean watching my whole world shift, I might have turned away in fear. But as I pack the last boxes for my new chapter, I see how every painful truth and every quiet boundary has led me here, not just to a different place, but to a different version of myself. I've learned that loss isn't always a tragedy. Sometimes it's a doorway to the life you're meant to live. The road from betrayal to healing is rarely straight, but every step has taught me something about courage, self-respect, and the true meaning of family. Looking back, I see a mosaic of lessons: the shock of betrayal, when my relocation fund vanished, the realization that manipulation can wear a smile, the loneliness of being gaslit by those you trust most. I remember the quiet strength I found in small acts: saving receipts, saying no, choosing my own peace over someone else's approval. Each struggle taught me that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's the foundation of every healthy relationship, whether at work or at home. The aftermath was messy and real. I watched reputations crumble, friendships shift, and loved ones face consequences none of us ever wanted. But in the ashes, there was space for honesty. I learned to draw boundaries that let love in while keeping harm out. Through therapy and community, I found my voice again, not as a weapon, but as a bridge to something better. I realized healing is slow, but it's possible, especially when we stop pretending and start speaking our truths. Today, as I step into the unknown with Andrew trying in his own way, Lucille forced to reflect, and Sylvia learning to stand on her own, I know the past will always be a part of me. But it no longer controls the story I write. For the first time, I feel free to dream again, to build a life where love is mutual, respect is real, and my happiness is not a negotiation. If my story resonated with you, please know you're not alone. Maybe you've faced your own family storms or lost yourself trying to keep the peace. I hope you'll share your story below, because your voice matters. If you found strength or comfort here, I'd be grateful if you liked, subscribed, or left a comment. It helps us build a community where no one has to heal in silence. Every story shared is a light for someone else. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Remember, you have the right to protect your heart, to draw boundaries, and to begin again. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go and trust that what's waiting for you is better than what you've left behind.